Hey everybody, for those watching online, my name is Caleb Hurt. I want to say thank you so much for clicking on my link. I also want to thank all of my audience members for showing out today. Yes, thank you, thank you. Yep. And we got one more there, yes. Dr. Barlow, I know that I said in my outline of the speech that I was going to have 8 males actually in this who didn't know how to properly shoot video on a camera. Unfortunately, they couldn't show out today, so I brought these 5 ladies in. They were available, but they also have never shot or learned how to properly shoot on a video camera. So that's why we're here today, and that's what my speech is about. So to roll to the first slide, the whole reason I wrote this speech is because everybody's a videographer today. That used to be me. I just gave myself that term because I went to the store, I bought a camera, and just started shooting for people. But what I really want to break down in this speech is 5 different components on how to shoot properly that can really separate you from somebody who doesn't or who just bought a camera and doesn't know how to use it. And those 5 things are the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, video format, and pulling focus. Those are all 5 key things that I believe in are very important, and with a little practice you can go from premature to pro really quick. So the first thing I want to talk about is the relationship between shutter speed and frame rate. Now what frame rate is, also known as FPS, frames per second, on a camera, is essentially the amount of frames that you get in 1 second. So think of a frame as like a picture almost, like somebody took a picture. But if you're putting like a certain amount of frames in 1 second, it's gonna move pretty fast, and that's what creates a video. And so typically what you'll see on a camera is 24 frames per second, which is the real time, kind of what your eye captures, which is 24 frames in 1 second. Now why this is related with shutter speed is because shutter speed, the shutter is located within your camera, and it shows how long light is going to go through the lens. And so the higher the shutter speed, the less amount of time that light's going to show through, which is going to create a darker image, and vice versa if you have a lower shutter speed. So the 180-degree rule here is what we want to do is we want to put our shutter speed double what our frame rate is. So if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, let's double that, and we're going to make our shutter speed 48 or whatever's closest on your camera to allow for that. Now the consequences for not doing this is you're going to get a jittery image, which is essentially going to mess up the whole film that you're trying to produce. So the next thing I want to talk about is aperture and cinematic depth. Aperture, in my opinion, is one of the most important things. It's also called the f-stop. They're the same thing, but it's the hole that's located inside of the lens. The wider that you open that hole, which on your camera would actually be the lower number. So the lower number you put your f-stop, the wider that hole opens. But when you do that, it allows for more light to go through the lens, but also you get more depth, more cinematic depth, which is what every filmmaker is really looking for. Now, why is this so important? It's because it creates that cinematic look, and when you have that wider pull, it becomes more important that you pull focus correctly and that you have your other adjustments set the same thing. The problem is when you have this hole so wide open to get the cinematic depth, typically you have so much light coming in, so that's why they invented the neutral density filter, which is essentially like sunglasses for your lens. You stick that on top, and it takes all of that light down so that you're able to keep the depth, but also have a shaded image so that you can suffice for the light that's getting through the lens. The next thing I want to talk about is ISO and light sensitivity. Now, the ISO, in my opinion, is one of the things that you want to kind of keep down. You don't really want to mess with this unless you really have to, because the ISO is camera controlled light. We really want a true image as filmmakers, and so that's why we don't really touch this unless we need to. But it essentially, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive you create the sensor to be to light, which is again camera controlled. But we try and keep the ISO as low as we can so that we don't have that fake light coming in trying to adjust our settings accordingly beforehand. When it comes to video format, this is something that you guys might be more familiar about because nowadays they're selling things like 4K TVs and different things like that. And on YouTube, you even have your selection to choose what kind of quality you want to watch your video in. And so the main thing that on how I learned this in the simplest terms is I want you to think of it kind of like a frame, right? Like let's say this was the frame for a 1080p image, and the video fits perfectly inside this frame. Now if you're shooting in 4K, it's going to be a larger image. So essentially the picture is going to be bigger than that frame. So in order for it to fit within this 1080p frame, if you're editing in a 1080p timeline, you just make it go smaller, which is going to create more detail. So it creates more details. And really the biggest thing that you want to know is know your output location on where you're trying to show your film. If it's just something on YouTube, there's no problem in shooting it in 1080p because there's really no screen that's going to be big enough on a phone or a computer that's going to really pixelate that image. But if it's on a huge projector screen or a Jumbotron, that's something you might want to reconsider, or even a movie theater, you know, to shoot in a higher quality. So the last thing I want to talk about here is the power of focus. Focus is so important, and I didn't know this in my early days until I really hammered in on it. The consequences of not pulling focus correctly are simply that you're just going to have that kind of blurred image. So it's really important to practice by taking your camera, picking an object to focus on, and really rack your focus and move back and forth. And you can even put on focus peaking on your camera, which shows what's in focus and what's not. And you know, some people can cheat with autofocus, but as a filmmaker, I believe that manual focus is really what's going to pull most of the time to get your, if you really put in your best effort, it's really going to show out and make that more accurate than autofocus. So the last thing I just want to say is go shoot. My hope is that you guys learned something here that you could actually go and practice. And if you want to earn some side cash or you do this as a full-time living, you could become a true videographer and do this for a living. And so these are my references here. This is the first page, and this is the second page of my reference sheet. And I just want to thank you guys so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys for watching online.